The People's Platform.
Hello there, a very good evening and welcome to another edition of The People's Platform. We've been discussing the way forward for Sri Lanka and policy, something that the general public of Sri Lanka does not pay too much regard to or doesn't really quite understand, has been earmarked as one of the main shortfalls that has led Sri Lanka to the current crisis that it finds itself in today. And of course, to come out of this crisis, what we need to do is fix policy consistency, things that many people in Sri Lanka, like I said before, don't understand too much and tend to disregard too soon. To discuss these matters and much more, we've got with us Amitha Arulpragasam. She is an independent policy analyst. A very good evening, Amitha, and welcome to the show.
Good evening, Sharon. Thanks for having me.
So, Amitha, when we speak about policy, now, like I said before, we have been having certain discussions on policy, what Sri Lanka's education policy should be, what Sri Lanka's defense policy should be. We really think of it as kind of a reading on what should be done. What should Sri Lanka do in education? What should Sri Lanka do in defense? That is the general understanding, at least, that the public in Sri Lanka has about this word policy. So what does policy really mean?
Policy, as you've alluded to, is very broad. It can refer to a whole different bunch of sectors in the country, education, defense. But, when you think about policy, there are several aspects. As how you design policy, how people receive policy, the history of our policies in a particular country or context, obviously different regions or, different interest groups. So it's broad, it's large. It can include things like gender and economics, it is also a secondary. There's law, and then there's regulation that is created within state institutions. So that's also important and a critical part of how we think of policy.
So, Amitha, if I put you in the spot and ask you, could you describe what policy means to me without using the word policy? Could you do that?
So it's a set of regulations which would determine how individuals in a society or polity function, and nudge people towards certain parts of behavior as opposed to others.
So let's talk about policy in Sri Lanka. Compared to the other countries in the world, Sri Lanka is of course part of the global village, and we need to compete with the other countries as much as we do work with them. So it's good to compare ourselves to them. Let's take our most closest neighbors, for example. When it comes to policy and the importance placed on policy, and of course at least having stable policies in a country, how does Sri Lanka fare with its regional peers?
Well, Sri Lanka is slowly beginning, or let's say it has recently faced an economic crisis. So in terms of our economic policy, we're not doing too well.
Even now?
We're doing a little bit better. More recently, there's been stability in terms of prices and economic activity, but we still have a long way to go in terms of improving our economic growth. So in terms of our regional peers, where we still have a lot of catching up to do, and actually we've fallen behind a little bit.
A little bit?
Quite a bit, I would say. That's on economic policy. There's also, again, so many different, aspects of policy. There's, the way we treat our minorities is also part of our ethnic and reconciliation policy. That we have a long path before us. There's a lot to do.
So when we speak about ministers and the executive arm of the government, at least what we're thought of is that they are supposed to be policymakers. They are supposed to be policymakers. The legislative arm is supposed to be the lawmaking arm, and of course the judicial arm is the judiciary. So when we speak about the president, the cabinet of ministers, do we really have policy makers in the true sense of the word in Sri Lanka?
We're supposed to have policymakers. Our elected representatives play an important role in that they vote on certain policies. They propose laws which are forms of more stable policy, let's say.
Which is like a personification of the policy, solidification, crystallization of policies.
Exactly. It's policy that takes a little longer to dismantle.
Okay.
And so, yes, our elected representatives are policymakers technically. Are they good policymakers? I think that's a different question. And I think examining actually the kind of the policies and the laws that exist in this country, how they impact people, how they've been designed, whether with through a consultative approach, whether they meet the interests and the needs of the country, and also provide a path for the country to develop and grow and for its people to prosper. These are all criteria by which you can determine whether policy is good and the policymakers who are designing these policies are worth their salt.
Now, Amit, I know I'm straying away a little bit from what we initially planned on discussing on this program, but just out of curiosity, now when we look at moving forward as a country, it's important that we discuss, identify issues and address these issues properly, because for the longest time now we've been playing the blame game. One political party says they're thieves, the other political party says they're thieves. Now all of them have come together and they're saying that the state sector employees are thieves, and the cycle just goes on and on. So policymakers, like you said, are important to Sri Lanka. The cabinet of ministers headed by the president are supposed to be policymakers, and I think it's common knowledge that members, or a majority of members in cabinet, and even a majority of politicians who have been in parliament and cabinet for decades on end, still do not understand these concepts of policy, how to make policy. What usually happens in Sri Lanka is everybody is politicking. So in terms of addressing that issue, in terms of making our policy makers understand what policy is and what should be done to create good policies and be a good policymaker, is there anything really that the private sector could do?
Well, there's a lot that the public, I think, should advocate for. Let's start there. I think in terms of I think perhaps the most important thing in terms of determining what a good policy is if it actually serves the public's interest, right?
But does it have to be a popular policy?
Not necessarily. I mean, not necessarily, right? Like, this is again the question. This is kind of the way we distinguish between formal democracies and substantial democracies. Formal democracies have certain, they have elections and certain functions that they follow. Substantive democracies have safeguards for minorities. They have certain human rights protections, and so policies should serve the public's interest, but it should also, good policies create good polities, create good societies. These are places where it's enjoyable for almost any citizen to be able to live, and which creates conditions, a polity which creates conditions of social harmony where it's actually enjoyable to live and interact with people of diverse backgrounds. There's different ways of conceiving of good policy, but yes, it has to serve social welfare. And I think one of the important ways that we can achieve that is actually by making sure that the policy makers or the elected representatives who are in parliament, who are determining and designing policies, actually are individuals who represent the interests of the people, and so can design policies that serve those interests, but also that there are people who who are democratically elected. And we're talking about politicians today. We're talking about a democracy, and I was hoping to talk about the online safety bill at some point, but at some point. It's important to make sure our elected representatives also that the barriers to entering Parliament are minimal, so that our Parliament can actually represent the democratic interests of the country, so that if it costs a lot of money to run an election, you're already creating a huge barrier for people to enter Parliament and to run in politics, and you're skewing who gets to be a policymaker and who represents the interests of the people, and in that sense you're less likely to have policymakers reflecting the interests of the people, right? So in terms of having a set of parliamentarians that represent the interests of the people, it's really important to make sure we address things like campaign finance, to go back to the original question of what can we do to make sure we have good policies and we have good policymakers. We really do need to strengthen our democracy in these ways.
So just before we cross over to a short commercial break, Amita, now I'm going to ask you a bit of a question that might sound like what comes first, the chicken or an egg?
Yeah.
So policy, now as we know, across the board in Sri Lanka, not too many people are aware of what policy is and what it can really do to prosper, to contribute in the prosperity of a nation. So which section should be educated first on policy? Are the constituents or the politicians?
Well, I would say the population, actually, just because the politicians emerge from the people. The population. But also the population is far more significant in terms of numbers than politicians in our country. So if you're educating the public, then you're just educating a larger number of people on what policy is. But
of course there is the number, the large number. It's harder to do the entire population, and at least a little bit, or at least numerically, easier to approach a politician.
Yes, but I actually don't think policy is that difficult to understand. Policy is everywhere. It can be state policy, it can be policy within the private sector. If you go to work, you're impacted by certain policies. If you go to school, you're impacted by education policy. If you go to the doctor, then certain health policies determined in the health sector are going to impact what part of the health sector you interact with, or that is well designed in the country. So policy is actually present everywhere, and once you see it, it's hard to unsee. Right? It's simply the trickier things are like, how do we design good policy? How do we make sure policy is communicated well, and that people understand why policies are being implemented in a particular way? And how do we receive feedback from the public and from stakeholders that can be integrated back into our policy design, so that our policy is always constantly serving the public and the interests of the country and the vision that we want to see for the country going forward.
So putting mechanisms, processes in place to do exactly that. And would I be right if I just loosely define policy as a society or a group of people coming to a final determination on how things should be done?
I wouldn't say a final determination, because policy...
Maybe an evolving,
it's a set of rules, a set of processes.
But it has to evolve in one way.
Policy changes, right? Like governments change, policies change.
But is that acceptable? I think that's one of the issues that Sri Lanka is facing right now.
I think policy consistency,
yes, exactly,
and making sure we have that is extremely important. But that requires consensus. And as societies evolve and progress and ideas change, we should also expect policies to change and reflect what evolving ideas societies have about the country that they'd like to live in.
Sounds like a bit of a contradiction there.
Possibly, but I mean, it's just a set of, I think maybe the simplest way to think about it is a set of rules that are designed with the interests of people at heart, but are constantly evolving to meet people's don't stay
constantly
stagnant.
Evolving to meet the people's needs.
People's needs, yeah, because people societies don't stay stagnant, and institutions don't stay stagnant. Ideas about how we ought to live don't stay stagnant. And so we should also expect our policies to evolve as we do.
Thank you very much, Amita. We'll cross over to a short commercial break and bring you more on the other side. Stay tuned. You're watching The People's Platform.
The People's Platform.
මේක තමයි රූම්. කීමණී වුණත් ඉතින් මාස 4කවත් ගන්න ඕන. ඒකත් කමන්නේ. මට මාසෙක දෙන්න.
අලුතින් ජීවිතයක් පටන් ගන්න වාට ඕනේ. එහෙනම් ඉතින් වාට අභිමාන අමතක කරන්න වෙනවා.
මගේ හුස්ම තියෙනකන් අභිමානව නම් මට කවදාවත් අමතක කරන්න බැරි වෙයි අක්කේ.
මට වාහනයක් නැහැ, මට ගෙයක් දොරක් නැහැ, මට ඉන්න තැනක් නැහැ.
අභිමාන් මේ ඔයා ඔය දුක විහිං තලු මර රස විඳින්න.
නීල පබලු අද රාත්‍රී 9ට සිරස ටෙලිතිරයෙන්.
මේ කුස්සියට ඇවිල්ලා මේ තියෙන දේවල් පාවිච්චි කරන්න තරම් හයියක් කොහෙන්ද ඔයාට ආවේ? මේ ගෙදරට කන්න බොන්න කෑම හදන්න කවුද ඔයාට අවසර දුන්නේ ඉන්නේ?
මට හරිම දුකයි. ඒ වගේ මාදිත් එක්ක තරහයි. ළමයි අම්මා තාත්තව සතුටින් තියන්නයි හදන්නේ ඒත් අපේ පුතා. අද රාත්‍රී 9:30ට සිරස ටෙලිතිරයෙන්.
New media is something called viral dissemination. That's, I think, the key, which is if a online publication is made, it can be shared by others.
And I do think that, especially on the online safety bill, that the corporate sector, those in the IT industry, should be concerned.
If you look at the budget in terms of the kind of what that has been imposed and the spiral effect it's happening, you already have almost 73% of consumers saying, as per the Nielsen study, that they are only having 2 meals per day.
What was circulated amongst a select crowd was part of that bill, part of that law that was proposed in Singapore.
I don't agree with the legislation that resulted, but I can't fault it for the process that it went through.
Face the Nation, Wednesday nights at 9:30 on TV1.
TV1. TV for life.
Parliament prorogued again. President prepares for an all-party discussion on the IMF agreement.
තාම අපේ දේශපාලනේ පපඩංගවා. තාච්චිර දැම්ම නැගලෙනකොට අරගෙන කනවා. අමතක වෙනවා. ඊළඟ දවසේ තව එකක් ගන්න. ඔක නෙලා තියෙන්නේ.
Do not create conflict between the judiciary and the parliament. Review the amendments before signing the online safety bill. Many factions make a request from the speaker. Who are the masked men who attacked peaceful protesters? Civil activists complain to the Human Rights Commission. Mortal remains of Sanat Nishanta brought to Puttala. Fatal accident along the expressway. 1 foreigner dead. No program to save us. We can't bear this torment. Sri Lankan youth caught in the clutches of terrorists in Myanmar cry for help.
TV1. TV for life.
The People's Platform.
Welcome back. You're watching The People's Platform. We're in discussion with Amita Arulpragasam, an independent policy analyst, about this very interesting concept of policy. Amita, getting back to our discussion now, we discussed what policy is, what a good policymaker is, and what Sri Lanka should really do in terms of trying to get good policymakers, let alone the best policymakers. We need good policymakers, at least to begin with, for Sri Lanka to move out of this rut that we're in right now. Let's talk about the current situation in the country. Now, it's generally known that Parliament has lost faith among the general public given the Aragalaya that took place just a few years back and the expulsion of a democratically elected president in Sri Lanka. Much has happened, things that have never happened in Sri Lanka before. As it stands, Parliament is still a lawmaking body and legally elected. They are holding office legally. There is a cabinet that functions, and those cabinet members create policy for Sri Lanka. So let's take a look at what kind of policy is being created right now, and if it is the right thing, the wrong thing, how can it be made better. One of the most recent pieces of legislation, or at least controversial pieces of legislation that was passed, was the online security bill. Now, the procedure of passing this bill has also been questioned by legal luminaries like President's Counsel M.A. Sumanthiran, but let's take a look at the policy aspect of this entire thing. Is this good policy, bad policy? How do you really analyze this even?
Well, I think when you're looking at a piece of policy or a law, one thing that is incredibly important, as I mentioned before, is how clearly and transparently the policy is communicated to the public. And also to parliamentarians, right, who are debating the legislation in Parliament. So this policy, the online safety bill, this law, it was gazetted by the Minister of Public Security in September, and then it was tabled in Parliament in October. And then 2 days ago, on January 24th, it was passed in Parliament. Now, this bill, as you rightly said, is very controversial, but it's also gone through, the process by which it was debated and passed came under scrutiny by, M.A. Sumanthiran and Harini Amarasuriya and other members of Parliament, because it didn't go through due procedure. Now, this parliamentary procedure is not just, there for fun.
For the kicks of it.
For the kicks. It's actually there to make sure that parliamentarians can have an informed debate about the ins and outs of the policy or the law. And it's there to ensure that the public is well informed about the impacts of that policy. And what happened, or what these parliamentarians are saying has happened, is that now this online safety bill was presented, and it was then challenged, right, by before the Supreme Court by 45 petitioners, and the Supreme Court said it would be constitutional if 31 amendments are made. Right, the parliamentarians, President's Counsel M.A. Sumanthiran, said that 13 of these amendments had not been made.
But then again, this is just an allegation.
It's an allegation, right? But it's a serious allegation, and so it should be taken seriously. In addition to that, right, there is a procedure in Parliament where you have, according to the standing orders, this bill is supposed to be referred to a sectoral oversight committee after the second reading. And then a report is supposed to be produced to parliamentarians. This report was not produced in a timely way, so it wasn't available to members of Parliament. And it also barely mentions the bill. So in that sense...
And it's a one-page report.
Exactly. So it doesn't really... This is kind of like an anomaly in terms of what actually normally happens in Parliament, right? It's not part of the custom. And it's alarming because it doesn't allow for informed debate. And that means that the policy is neither, it's not communicated well to parliamentarians, a debate can't happen, and it's not communicated well to the public. And that's a really important part of making sure we all understand what's happening and, what freedoms are maybe being limited and so on. So that's one thing, the process by which the bill or the law, the policy is communicated to the public and debated in Parliament. Another aspect of this is actually what is the public saying, or what does the public think about this law, and how is it going to affect our society, how is it going to affect the country that we live in, and the vision of the future of this country that we live in.
So Amita, real quick, because we're in the final few minutes of the show, is this bad policy because proper procedure was not followed, or is it just bad policy?
I believe it's bad policy for a whole host of reasons. Economically, it threatens freedom of expression. It has been criticized by human rights defenders, by journalistic groups, by
the Asian Internet Coalition.
Exactly, by which consists of very huge tech companies. It has been criticized by the IT BPM industries, which the huge part of the digital economy was touted as a way in which the country could grow, right? And a way in which we could achieve the economic growth that this country needs to get us out of this economic crisis. And this piece of legislation is actually going to, prevent us from achieving those levels of growth.
So according to what you're saying right now, correct me if I'm wrong, but this piece of legislation is both substantially bad policy and procedurally bad policy as well. So both aspects. And like you said before, this kind of encapsulates your entire argument that you've been making, that policy is in everything that we do.
Yeah, it's absolutely in everything we do. This is bad policy in terms of its likely economic impacts, in terms of the law itself and its kind of limits that it places on our freedom of expression. And and also in terms of the procedures that have not been followed.
Thank you very much, Amita Arulpragasam, an independent policy analyst. And of course, we do hope that you would continue to be independent, and then you can come on our programs and express your independent stance on what really is happening in Sri Lanka and in terms of Sri Lanka's policy. Thank you very much to all our viewers out there for tuning in to another episode of The People's Platform. Until we see you again, take care and God bless.